Hello, and welcome again to the VAW-VRC Foundation's Oral History Project. The project's goal is to share great stories from the E2 and C2 communities of naval aviation. I'm Joe McNamara, and today we're continuing our interview with Mr. David Seeman, a Navy veteran, one of the Grumman test pilots who was instrumental in bringing the C2 and E2 aircraft to the fleet in the 1960s. In our discussions so far, we've heard about Dave's early interest in aviation, his Navy career flying fighter aircraft and doing flight test work while in uniform, and his transition to the civilian flight test world with Grumman in the early development of the E2 and C2. Today we'll continue to discuss Dave's test pilot career, including work on the aircraft F9F, F11-1, A6, TC-4C, and the OV series of aircraft. Welcome back, Dave, and thanks for sitting down with us again. We'd like to hear some of your stories about testing some of these other aircraft that you were working on back in those days.
Okay, I went back over my my logbooks to make sure that I had the right airplanes at the right time, and that gets a little confused at times as you go back through these things. But I think we had indicated before, and it went through my career, that said after leaving the Bureau of Aeronautics representative's job at Grumman for 2 years, in 1953, I wound up going back to active duty, and my active duty was at CIC school. And then down out to Glenview, and went through that. And the ultimate of going through CIC school was to put the commissioning crew of the Forrestal, and I was going to be one of the initial CIC people. One of the reasons, in checking on my records, I realized that I had in my last year on the FDR, I had stood a whole batch of shipboard watches, and I was, at least on paper, a qualified OD underway. So I think this is probably the thing that got me on the Forrestal. And I went ahead and about the time we were getting ready to commission her, I got a call from Grumman, and they said, yeah, we'd very much like to have you up here as an engineering pilot. They were looking at what they were going to be faced with. They had put in for the what became the E2 and also the A6. And I had, as my background was Corsairs, and I had done some flying on the prototype E1 while I was Navy, and wound up going aboard ship, and very shortly thereafter, I think after the first week of commissioning, I got a letter, yep, go ahead. And I basically resigned a regular commission at that time to go with Grumman. And when I arrived there in early November of, that would have been 55, I was immediately put to work, and I could see why. We had F9F 8Ps, 8T coming along, and we also had the situation where it was obvious that I was going to be sent to test pilot school as a Grumman pilot. We had already had a couple of pilots through there. Norm Coutant had been in class 6. John Norris, who came up to the bar at the same time I did, and had gone with Grumman. He went in class 16, and I was slated to go in class 7. So I had the opportunity of going through test pilot school, but as a as a Grumman pilot rather than as a Navy pilot. I was still reserve, but that made no difference, I don't think. And it was a period of time, by the way, and I think this is a sidebar that should be on there, that there was a lot of question about who was going to fly all these high-priced new aircraft. Going through the sound barrier and everything along those lines, and with the proliferation of new aircraft that were coming up at that period of time because of the advent of jet engines. So you could see there was going to be a big change, and there was a little, I would say, almost fighting between the civilian world and the military world as to who was going to do the testing. So I know that in Grumman's case, Norm Coutant had gone through in Class 6 and came back saying, "Hey, they're very, very serious about training test pilots, and it's going to be a little problem and something very, very necessary to get our people down there." And Grumman being Grumman, they were afraid that as something like SETP, Society of Experimental Test Pilots, got organized and was up and running out at Edwards, we better get some people out there. Our upper management was thoroughly convinced that this was going to be the beginning of a test pilots union, but it definitely was not that. Worked out very well, and I was very, very happy to have the opportunity to go through it in Class 17. Then went back and got heavily involved in the F9F8, 8P, 8T, and as I had done quite a bit of the chasing before I went to test pilot school as a Grumman pilot, I did a lot of chasing of the F-11F, particularly Corky Meyer's spins on the short-nosed airplane, which was the first setup for spins. And the contract that I wound up signing and saying, yes, I'll do, was spins which would include tactical entry spins, vertical entry, and in all of the configurations, the stores configurations that the airplane was designed for. So that took about 3 years while I was doing other things. When the airplane is up, we were spinning. George Watkins, Commander George Watkins, was the project pilot on the F-11 for flight test and carrier suitability here at Grumman. I'm sorry, here at Patuxent. And he was thoroughly convinced, and rightly so, that we ought to get into the vertical entries and everything else. A number of other airplanes were experiencing what was known at that time as post-stall gyrations. It wasn't a true spin, but the airplane was all over the air. And as we know, the F-7U-1 had some nasty situations, which included at least 2 ejections of the airplane when it was going through a post-stall gyration.
Hey, Dave, may I ask a question while you're talking about spins? Some of our audience will probably not be as aviation savvy as you and the naval aviators are. Can you tell us what is a spin and what's it like to voluntarily enter a spin?
Well, there is basically you're taking an airplane, and it can be done at speed, or it can be done, and is usually done in the landing or slow flight configuration, and you run out of airspeed, and the airplane will then do what it wants to do, which is usually roll off on a wing and get into an auto-rotational situation that is known as a spin. The newer airplanes at that period of time were not doing that. They were getting into some very strange gyrations due to the fact that the loading was changing. You now had swept wings, and the airplane was basically doing what it wanted to do. And as we were finding out, if you did this and you started this, which you would at high altitude, which would be above 30,000 feet, the air being as thin as it is did not behave the way it does down at sea level. And the airplane's got to do some very, very interesting gyrations. But it's letting an airplane try and get out of a no forward airspeed maneuver. And it'll happen on a Piper Cub, it'll happen on everything else. When we're in a slower speed airplane, most of the time, and airplanes are designed so they can be recovered using the normal aerodynamic controls that are on the airplane. In the case of the higher speed aircraft, it got a little different, and that's why it was going to be something that you particularly wanted to be careful of for carrier airplanes, because one of the things that we know you've got to have an airplane approach the ship or go off the ship at as slow an airspeed as you can get away with as far as going off. For a catapult shot, you have to have an airplane that is controllable at the speed that the lowest speed the catapult can get that airplane to. In the case of the approach and landing, it's a matter of, can you fly it slow enough so that your equipment for stopping the airplane aboard ship, your hook and the cables that go with it, you'll be able to get down to the speed that will allow you to go aboard. So there's two things, particularly with carrier aviation, that have to be accomplished, and part of it has to do how slow can you go in the airplane before it becomes uncontrollable. So this basically is the reason you do a spin program.
So Dave, you were considered that was a special area of expertise for you, was the spin work. Did you have any trepidation or nervousness about flying all of these aircraft close to their flyability envelopes?
Well, I think as you go along and as you train, as you build up little experience, you realize, hey, if you have too much trepidation in this area, you don't do it. And I think this has probably chased a lot of people away from taking up flying as a sport, because stall spin accidents are the things that yes, are there, and you, the pilot, are the guy who is going to keep the airplane away from that situation. George Watkins was I think he was very correct. I didn't like it at the time, but the tactical entries are very important for an airplane that is going to the limits of its capability at a whole batch of altitudes. And that's where you have to fight it. And my trepidation when I got the program and was doing it, and realizing that the jet engine, and that was the J65 8-18 with an afterburner, that engine did not like to stall at do an airplane stall, follow an airplane that it is in at above 30,000 feet, because it had a problem staying alive, and you wound up with some very, very interesting compressor stalls, noises, smoke leaving the airplane, and if you happen to be flying backwards down a vertical entry stall before the airplane is flipped through, it's a very interesting situation to be following your own contrail, which is being also supplanted by the smoke that's coming from the engine. And I didn't like what I was seeing on the gauges, because the exhaust gas temperature was going up very rapidly while I was doing that. And we worked out a pretty good way to take care of it. We opened we opened up the valves in the back and reduced the pressure on it, and we were able to get through a program. Actually, we did something like around 600 stalls in that vertical stalls, and it was vertical stalls and just about everything else we did. But our total of all of the stalls we did on that program was around 600, and they're well documented. And it probably was a big eye opener for me, because I hadn't done too much of that. And if you remember my prior comments, I was also a little prone to air sickness. I got over that very, very quickly.
Dave, another follow-up question for you about, most of the people that we talk to are from the E2 and C2 communities, but these aircraft that you flew, some of them are not that well known to us. Could you have any fond memories of the F9 or the F11-1 or any of these other aircraft?
Yes, and I think the F9 was a very pilot-friendly airplane as an airplane, and as probably the first. I can't say fully satisfactory, but the first airplane that the Navy was able to use as a carrier-based fighter, and that was the major airplane that opened up jet aviation to the Navy, and it was a nice airplane to fly, and didn't have any real nasty characteristics. That was a particularly good one. The F-11 was a particularly nice airplane to fly, except for the engine situation. It needed some help, and of course it was very, very shy on fuel. And we flew the airplane with 2 or 3 different types of tanks, none of which external tanks, none of which gave you enough to really keep the airplane with the endurance that it needed to do its job. So that was, but it was a fine flying airplane, which the Blue Angels, I think, pretty well proved at the time. I think they were in the airplane for about 12 years. Some others that I really enjoyed, and to get on with the story, at this time, the company won the A6 contract and the W2F, which became the E2 contract, and which said we better get people ready for those programs. And I was the guy that they grabbed for the W2F. Because of my CIC background, and because of the fact that by that time I had quite a bit of time in the S2 series and the E1, because I had during this period of time that I was also doing the spins on the F11. I was also doing the electronic demonstration, the contractual electronic demonstration for the E1. So that got me up to speed a little bit on what the Navy was looking for in the early warning and command and control side of the show. And because of the fact that I was chosen for that, I knew that's where I was going to be going after the F-11 program. They said, "Hey, you better get yourself some turboprop time because the E2, of course, is going to be a turboprop." So we were also developing the Army's YAO as a surveillance and an Army support aircraft, the Mohawk. And I think of all the airplanes I've flown, I had more fun flying the Mohawk than any other airplane I got into, because it was a nice flying little thing. It was little. I think we started out at about 10,000 pounds. And by the time we were finished with it many years later, we were pretty close. We were pushing about 20,000 pounds on the same airframe. But that's, it was a very nice machine. It did teach you quite a bit about minimum single engine control, which is a very useful thing to have a pretty good idea about, because it is, of course, one of the things that we're also very much concerned with in the E2C2 series. VMC is one that can get you in an awful lot of trouble if you're not watching your angle of attack and airspeed at the same time. But at any rate, that was the route I went on, so that when the W2F or E2A was ready for first flight, I was not one of the first flight pilots on it. That went to Tommy Attridge, and I think I had already mentioned that he was on the program, and he was the project designated project pilot for the first flight of the W2E2. And Carl Alber, who was a phenomenal guy in multi-engine airplane, and also had done a lot of the very detailed work on the F4F, the Wildcat, during the war, and a close friend and a very able guy. And Tom and Carl did the first flight on the W2F-1, and for that we used two chase. We used a high altitude chase and a low altitude chase. The low altitude was the T-28, and that fell to me, and Bob Smythe, who was also an ex-flying midshipman, but from a couple of years earlier than myself, and had been to on exchange duty to England. Very competent guy. Wound up doing the work on the A6. He was the first flight pilot on the A6, and also on the Gulfstream series, along with Carl. So we had a number of us that stood up to the numbers of aircraft that Grumman had designed and were putting out in that time frame.
Dave, can you a couple more questions to follow up on this? So what time frame are we at when you're starting to work in the W2F?
I started and in about 59. I had finished the spin program. I was alternating between work on the 11, the eights were there. We had still had a lot of work to do on those. The Mohawk and the E2 was coming along, so we began to spend some of our time talking to people, working with the engineers as we came into the first flight, which I believe was in 60. I don't have that one firmly, but I believe the first flight of the W2F was in 1960. I've got
I have another question for you is, most of us have seen pictures of the early E2A. Is that what the W2F looked like? Or was it the same basic design? Would we recognize it, I guess, is what I'm asking.
You would recognize it, but you got to look a little close, because if you look at the pictures that we've taken, matter of fact, there's one of the first three E2s or W2Fs, and each one has a different set of tail feathers on it. The biggest problem that, of course, we had, and I've mentioned it before, the fact that the airplane was designed by spec to be able to be operated on an Essex class carrier. It gave you some design requirements that had to be met in order for the plane to be acceptable. And basically, that had to do with size, the fact that it was limited to the centerline elevators of the Essex class carriers. This tells you how long you could be, and how much deck space it took was a function of the hangar bays on the Essex class carriers. So it said you had to have, even though you had to have the big wings to hold the airplane in a search position at 30,000 feet, so that you had to be thinking about a design that was something like a sailplane at altitude with a high aspect ratio wing. But then you also had to be able to control the airplane with, at that time, and they still are, very powerful propeller-driven props, propeller-driven engines, turbine engines, and you were kind of between a rock and a hard place as far as the dimensions of the airplane were concerned. How you would be able to make that work. I think they did a pretty good job, but we, in flight tests early on, we had a problem making the airplane fit the specifications that it had to for flying qualities. And of course, the design was fixed physically, so there was a lot of development work that had to go on with the airplane at the same time that we've got an all new set of electronics in the back end of the airplane, and new antennas and new everything. What had been done then was we kind of divided up the where and how we did the testing. And we had the one operation at Bethpage, and that's where all our electronic brains were, in the Bethpage area. And we kept the number 3 airplane in Bethpage, and Tom pretty well took that one over after we had worked very hard on the first 2 airplanes to get them acceptable from a flying quality standpoint. And Walt Burnt and I and Bill Bedell, for a period of time, were out at Calverton, Peconic, and our job was to go ahead and finish up the work that we had started when Tom had been available to be with us, to make the lateral directional characteristics of the airplane acceptable for Navy specs.
So Dave, the next segment, we're going to talk about E2 and C2 in greater detail. But before we wrap up this one, I wondered if, would you like to say anything about your A6 experience or TC4C or any of the other aircraft types that you were?
Well, yeah, the A6 came because of some of the other things I was doing collaterally with the C2E2. One of the things I also got because I had been the most recent carrier guy, John Norris had been about the same as I was, but he was tied up with some other stuff. So I wound up getting the reconfigured AJ-1 Savage airplane with the installation of both the A6 and E2 nose gear configuration, so that the two airplanes could be the first airplanes the Navy used for nose toe catapult work. Both of the, if you look real closely at the nose gears and the hardware on both of those airplanes, they're the same. And the way it was done was we put because of its weight and availability, we took the structural test version, the one airplane that was left of the first 3 or 4 AJ-1s, and they shipped the whole fuselage up to Bethpage, where we installed basically an A6 E2 nose gear, the whole nose gear, support structure, and everything else onto that airplane, and then shipped it back down to Patuxent, where it had come from. Put the wings back on, put the engines back on. We made it a non-flying test bed, and I, for one reason or other, I think I must have said something nasty to somebody in management at one time, but I wound up as the pilot, quotes, of this machine that was now going to go through all of the launching requirements that would be laid on both the A6 and the E2 W2F, which included minimums, maximum off centers, but everything that those airplanes would have to do on catapult launches from H8 or the C7 steam catapult down at PAX, and that was one of the things I had fun doing with, and it was a very, very interesting program, I think the engineers who did that for both of those airplanes at the same time, basically a high-speed airplane, relatively high-speed airplane, and a low-speed, heavyweight airplane. I think that was one of the real fine engineering jobs of that era. Because
that's a great story. Actually, it's very interesting from a engineering and aviation standpoint. I think that's a good place for us to pause, and we'll come back for our next segment, and we'll kind of dive onto the E2 and C2 early development. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, everyone. We'll be back shortly.